get a lot of questions about rabies, and people seem to have a lot of misconceptions about rabies. You know, how long it lasts in a carcass, what'll kill it, what'll help it, or what will not kill it. So the rabies we have in New York, we have a couple strains. We have raccoon strain, and we have bat strains. So unless you do a lot of work with bats, most of the other animals that you see are going to be infected with the raccoon strain. The raccoon strain started in Florida. It had been in Florida for a long time. Some folks went down there and trapped a bunch of raccoons and brought them to Virginia or West Virginia back in the late '80s, I think, for a hunting enclosure. And from there, it just took off up and down the East Coast. And it reached New York, I think, in 1992. And by 1993, when I started, I mean, that's all we were doing. Some days I'd come in and we'd be looking at 15, 20, almost 30 raccoons a day. We'd be killing raccoons and testing them for rabies, looking at dead ones. So I learned a lot about raccoons when I first started. The important thing to remember about this rabies virus, the raccoon strain, is that cold temperatures prolong the virus's lifespan. They keep it viable. Okay? So if you take a rabbit or raccoon and you put it in the freezer, 20 years from now, you could, provided there were no freezer failures, you could pull that raccoon out and that virus would still be viable. You could reinfect yourself. And that's something that could easily happen. You know, if you only single or double bag a raccoon, you put it in the freezer, the little claws are kind of frozen like this and you're jostling it around, you could easily go through those bags and go through your skin, potentially creating exposure. Heat is the enemy of viruses, so high temperatures is going to inactivate the virus. I don't recall what the temperature is exactly. I probably should have looked that up yesterday so I'd look smarter than I actually am. But if you've got a skunk that's out on the road and the sun's beating down on it, the rabies virus is going to be inactivated over time as that carcass comes up to temperature and it activates the virus. Was there something else I want to say about rabies, Beth? You ain't paying attention.
How is that different from the bat strain? As far as
well, the difference is that the strains are adapted to a different species. Okay, so the bat strain is adapted to bats. It can go into any mammal,
Right.
and the raccoon strain is kind of adapted to raccoons, and it can go into any mammal. So when you see skunks with rabies, it's the raccoon strain. When you see woodchucks with rabies, it's the raccoon strain because they're coming into contact with each other. The bat strain, the last two human fatalities we had in New York, as I recall, were both children, and they were both typed out to be silver-haired bat strain. And there were no reported exposures in either of those cases for a couple of reasons, perhaps. One, they were children, and maybe they were they were messing around with a bat, and then they didn't want to get in trouble and say anything to anybody after they got bit. The health department thinks that perhaps the bat landed on someone at night while they were sleeping. And it certainly is conceivable that you could get bit by a bat while you're sleeping and it wouldn't wake you up and you wouldn't notice it. They could lick your eye or a mucous membrane. So what they did was, after they determined that, they decided that anytime a bat is found, you know, in a house or in a bedroom and you didn't see it fly in, they wanted to test that bat for rabies. And that's the way I think it still is.
Are there different strains for each species of bat?
Well, they type that out as a silver-haired bat strain, so I think there is a couple different bat strains that they're able to type out in the lab. And I don't really do that much. I know a lot about it, but I could put you in touch with some folks that could tell you how to do it.
What about the fox rabies in northern New York and Canada? That is different from the raccoon rabies.
It is a different strain, and they can tell the difference. And as I understand it, we had fox strain in here back in the 70s and stuff. Lou Bercelli and those guys all were working on that.
But you don't see cases of that?
We don't see many cases of that anymore. We see in gray fox and in red fox, but more in gray fox we'll see raccoon strain. And gray fox seem to become very aggressive when they have rabies. So if you get a call, gray fox is attacking something, you can rest assured it's probably got rabies.
Can go over rabies pre-exposure for anybody who can't.
All right, well, that's a good point, Pat. I meant to cover that as part of this. So you guys all have the pre-exposure series, and that gives you a certain amount of protection from exposures that you don't realize you've had. All right? If you have an exposure, like you get a bite, you get bit by a rabbit raccoon or by a rabbit skunk, or you cut yourself while you're showing somebody the inside of a rabid woodchuck and you poke yourself with a scalpel while you're trying to point to the spleen, which has happened to me. You have to report that, any kind of exposure, to your supervisor and to the health department, employee health services. Fill out an accident report. And they will evaluate your exposure, and the doctor at the employee health services or the county health department doctor will determine whether you need to have the post-exposure rabies shots. If you have the pre-exposure series, like you all do, and you have a bite exposure, and you do receive the post-exposure treatments, which is only a couple shots in the arm, it's not that bad, over a week apart. I've been through it like 4 times. It's almost guaranteed that you'll live and everything after that. I always say almost, because you never know. But for the most part. There was a situation, New York State Health Department had somebody working with a machine that was spraying rabies virus onto some baits a number of years ago, before I was around. And the machine was malfunctioning. They didn't realize it. And they got probably a pretty massive aerosol dose of rabies, it turns out. And they had the post-exposure, or the pre-exposure shots like you guys have. But they didn't realize they had an exposure and didn't get the post-exposure shots. And it didn't end well. I mean, as far as I know, the person might still be alive.
Well, he recently died.
Did he recently die? But he was confined to a wheelchair, and he was out of. Did you know him?
I didn't know him, but I saw there was an article in the Times Union.
It was.
Probably within the last year about him who just died.
Yeah, but he was close to non-functioning, I
Right.
think,
Yeah.
after that. If you ever got some time on your hands and you want to see something really gross or really disturbing, you know, Google human rabies death and look for some YouTube videos of people dying from rabies. It looks pretty unpleasant.
I really want to emphasize the fact that if you're handling mammals, even the carcasses, punctures through the bags and moving stuff, this rabies is a big deal. We encounter, as the director of the rabies lab will tell you, we send people out to do CWD head collection and stuff, and they have more cases of rabid deer than we do of CWD and deer. In other words, nobody should be, no supervisor should be sending staff out who don't have pre-exposure if they're going to be dealing with animals.
Right, and
It's just dead or alive.
you should get a blood titer as technicians in wildlife, probably every 2 years.
We're doing it every year now.
Doing every year, that's even better. So that'll tell you your level of protection. If your level drops, then you'll get a booster shot.
Rabies lab, when we were building the CWD surveillance stuff, rabies lab made it very clear, we are first line for potential exposure for rabies. Wild animals, indeterminate origin, lack of history, so we would be equal to the rabies laboratory person. In other words, you should have your pre-exposure as a titers check before you can do this.
And that brings up a good point. Kevin was saying before, if you're working on a rabbit, and a lot of times you don't know.
Right.
So if there's an exposure, regardless of, we need, the nice thing is with that, at least you have the animal where we can have that animal tested.
Right.
You know, but if we don't, if we're working with a wild animal that escapes,
It's
then
presumed
it's
positive.
presumed, and we have to go through the steps. So
Yeah.
regardless of your pre-exposure, we can take that as a.
Right, and at any county, if you get a call from someone and they got a suspect rabid animal and there was a bite or a pet exposure, you want to refer them to the county health department because they have authority over any animal where there's any kind of contact with suspected rabies.
The other thing is you never make a call on if you think someone's been exposed. It's not DEC, that's human health,
Right.
that's the local county health department needs to make that call. They give you a story on the phone, tell them they gotta call the local county health department. They make a determination if there's been an exposure or if they're gonna get post-exposure vaccination. That's not our role.
And what I usually do is when they do call, this just happened the other day, I get their name and phone number and particulars, and I tell them to call the health department, and I give them the health department's number, and then I call the health department a couple hours later and ask if they heard from them. If they didn't, I provide their information to the person at the health department so they can follow up, just to kind of make sure that we've done everything we can. Ashley, you had a question?
You should explain why it's bad for rabies virus to go in your eye versus your hand.
All right, I will. That's a good point. Rabies virus in your eye, I mentioned that I think earlier when we were talking about eye protection. The way the virus works is, am I low on time? Oh, you okay, I thought you were going to pull me out. The way the virus works is it gets into you got a rabbit or raccoon, let's say, in this case, And once the virus is in the animal's brain, it alters its behavior. It makes it more aggressive. And at the same time, actually a little bit before it gets into the brain, it starts to reproduce and is shed in the saliva. So you've got this raccoon. He meets up with another raccoon in most cases, and they kind of face off. They never seem to back down from each other, and they go at it. He bites the non-infected raccoon. The teeth puncture the skin, so it gets past the barrier of the skin, and the saliva goes into the wound with the virus in it. The virus starts to replicate in the new animal. It finds its way to the nerves, and then it goes at they've actually experimentally determined how many millimeters per hour the virus travels. I don't remember what it is, but the information's out there. It goes up through the nerves and it works its way up to the brain, and then the cycle starts again. If you get rabies virus in your eye is just a short path from your eye into your brain, right down through the optic nerve and into your brain. So it's very serious if you get an eye exposure. If I got saliva in my eye, I would wash my eyes out with soap and water, regardless of how much it hurt. And I would just do it, and I would do it for 2 or 3 minutes at least, and run water over trying to get that out of there, and then report it immediately. And the same thing goes if you get bit, on the arm or the hand, you want to wash it out with plenty of soap and water. That's the first thing you want to do, and that can go a long way to helping you out, but you need to report it and probably go through the post-exposure series. Kristen has a different color now. Kristen has some wallet cards that she put together when she was at the National Wildlife Health Center that talks about zoonotic diseases, and you being a wildlife person that deals with a lot of wildlife, and it gives the physician or emergency medical responders kind of a heads up that you might have something that most other people might not have.
Yeah, so you're welcome to take one or more of these if you know somebody who might need it. This is just basically because, working with wildlife, I've actually had it before where you might go in and you tell your doctor, oh, I work with wildlife, and they're like, oh, that's cool. But they don't necessarily think more broadly about what you might be exposed to. If you go in presenting with flu-like symptoms, they're going to think that you have the flu because common things occur commonly. But since we're unique little butterflies, we tend to get exposed to different things, and especially after seeing the map that Beth put up, that we could be the first case of the newest disease that has never been seen in this country before. And so I'll pass these around. They've actually documented that these have been useful in saving somebody's life in the Fish and Wildlife Service. A person was incapacitated. They took him to the hospital, and actually one of the co-workers gave the treating physician one of these cards, and so that caused them to think more broadly about what the victim might have been exposed to. So.
And there was a biologist that died from plague, Grand Canyon National Park, a cat biologist. Did you know him?
I didn't know him, but I had some interactions with the people who worked on that case. He had been a fur bearer biologist in Massachusetts, so there were some people in New York who did know him. The backstory on that was that it was a collared cat. He took it home and did a field necropsy in his garage. He presented with flu-like symptoms to his local health. It was actually the Park Service Health Center. The doctor said, oh, you probably have the flu. He went home and died on his couch a few days later. So it was really a sad thing.
So as far as rabies goes, I guess I wasn't aware that there's specific for strain for raccoon and for fox. And we often get people, well, not often, but people always ask about exposure with their pet. And my understanding is if your pet has boosters, to just go ahead and call the vet. And do you know how that process works with them? Because people always freak out, my dog or cat found a dead skunk or whatever, now I need to worry.
Right. So the first thing you want to tell them is call the county health department and tell them the story, because it's their ball game.
So
What they're going to do when they get the call, though, is if it's just pet exposure, they're going to just say that the pet's got to be boosted. If they don't have the animal to test. If the animal is available to test, they'll test it. If it's negative, then it doesn't need a booster. If it's positive, it will need a booster. But they'll want to talk to the person about potential exposure between the pet owner or children and the pet. Oftentimes, they come out and they hear a commotion in the backyard, and the dog's squaring off with a raccoon, and there can be saliva on the dog's fur. And there have been cases where they've given humans post-exposure shots because they thought potentially they were exposed to the saliva, the raccoon saliva on the coat of the dog or pet. So, but the most important thing to remember is they need to talk to the county health department, and the county health departments vary in quality, probably to the richness of the county. I mean, some county health departments are pretty not very good, some are very good, but it's our job to make sure they get to the county health department level and they talk to them about it. We don't give that kind of advice because it's not our place.
So, but as far as the transmission, so raccoon can transmit rabies to any animal, or only the raccoon to raccoon
It can-
rabies?
All of the strains can go into any other mammal.
Okay.
So the strain is thing. Think of it as like it's a type of virus that's adapted to the lifestyle of that critter.
Okay.
All right. So the bat one usually just stays in bats, but it can go into Carl.
Yeah. It's
But Carl's a dead end host because Carl isn't probably not going to bite somebody else and give them rabies.
I don't know if you're a bagel.
So rabies, all the strains can go into any mammal and kill them. But
Okay.
it's an idea of it's not going to go, probably not going to go much beyond that. Although
Okay.
a raccoon strain, it does go beyond that sometimes, right? It goes from a raccoon maybe into a skunk, and that skunk could potentially infect another animal before. But chances are it's going to die out eventually. Whereas in raccoons, it just keeps going in the raccoons back and forth.
Okay.
Yes.
Last century, when I was a biology student, we learned that typically rodents there's no rabies in rodents. Is that still true?
Well,
They die from a attack or whatever?
yeah. I mean, they're susceptible to rabies. We have never. Well, we've had rabid rodents through the lab, beaver, for example. We've had a number of beaver cases. Typically what happens though, most rodents are small, right? And if a raccoon attacks them, chances are they're going to die from the wounds that they've received from the raccoon before they can actually incubate rabies. We've never seen a case in a squirrel. Theoretically it's possible, but we just never, the rabies lab hasn't diagnosed any as far as I know. So we think of them as kind of certainly dead-end hosts because they died before they even developed rabies.
Did you have a rabbit one time?
I don't think we did.
No?
Yeah. Now you certainly it could happen. We just haven't documented it.
With rabies, it gets into your brain, that's death, right?
That would be the end. Yep. Once it gets into your brain, it's all over.
So if it gets into your eyes, you should just immediately go.
Immediately. I would drop everything and just go. I'd leave whatever the animal. Well, I wouldn't leave. Secure the animal so they get tested because it might not be rabid, right? Yeah, I would make a priority to. I would call.
Like, it's a longer process.
You would have some. If you weren't pre-exposed, I'm not sure how they would handle it. I don't know. Typically, what they do, if you don't have the pre-exposure shots like we do, and you get bit, they're going to take some immunoglobulin and they'll put it in around the bite. But if it's in your eye, I'm not sure they're going to shoot it in your eye. I don't know. If they were, I'd like to watch it if they were going to do that. Pretty uncomfortable.
That's why you just.
Yeah. There was a human survival case where they treated a child that was supposedly exposed. They put her into a medically induced coma, lowered her body temperature. The idea is that you give her body some extra time to mount a defense. And in that one case, it worked. It was in Milwaukee. They call it the Milwaukee Protocol. And they've tried it several times since with no result. They've been able to.
You should follow up on that point. If you did handle a carcass or a live animal and you don't throw away the specimen because we want to test it, you've got a scratch or a bite or puncture.
Right.
In other words, if you're
Yes.
loading the incinerator, don't.
That's a good point.
Throw it in the incinerator.
Right. So you want to have it tested. If it's negative, then you're good to go. If they get a non-detect, or if they get a rabies lab, they call it unsatisfactory. If they can't if you shoot a raccoon in the head with a bird shot at close range and they can't determine what part of the brain they're looking at, and it doesn't light up when they put it under the fluorescent scope, they're going to call it unsatisfactory, and it's presumed positive. And that's why we don't shoot animals in the head. If the animal's too rotten and they have trouble identifying the right part of the brain and it doesn't light up when they look at it under the scope, they're going to call it unsatisfactory, and then it's presumed positive, and then everybody involved would get shots at that exposure.
Curious, I just want to double check. Do possums not get rabies?
The possums are our only marsupial in New York, and they're different from other mammals in a couple of different ways. Their physiology is a little bit different. Some people think that they posit that their body temperature is a little different, and that kind of helps them not get infected with rabies. They seem to certainly have some resistance. In the laboratory, it takes many times the normal dose to infect possums. And we've had at least, I think, 2 possum cases that have come through our lab where they've been infected. They certainly have confrontations with raccoons all the time, especially when you have people feeding animals in their backyard. And we've seen them with their faces just torn up being attacked by raccoons. But they generally come up negative in the test. Yes?
Carl talks about rabbits. We personally had a rabbit case at home. My stepson had a rabbit that started chewing his mother's wires, house wires, whatever. So we got it. My 2-year-old son would crawl in the cage with it, whatever. About a year later, when we get ready to go away on vacation, like one of the only ones we've done in 20 years, and it bit my husband. And it was an outside rabbit. It was cooped outside. And the health department said, we need to test that.
Yeah. Oh, I'm
Because
sure.
it was rabbits were more outside rabbits, which is susceptible to badly.
Certainly. Yeah. I agree.
And it was luckily negative, but, a day and a half before we're supposed to actually go away.
Right.
That
That could have ruined your vacation. Your husband came down with rabies, like near the end of your vacation.
It ruined my 3-year-old rabbit. It was.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of rabbits.
Quick question, not sure if you know the answer, but just about the raccoon rabies baits and why, is it just a scale issue and why they seem to be pretty effective in Long Island and Suffolk and Nassau compared to upstate?
I was unaware of that, if that's true.
Well,
You're
they were
saying-
able to, they had that outbreak back in 2006.
Right.
So
And
2008.
it went down.
And they basically didn't have detection for
Right.
9 years and then haven't been following it. And some they've had a couple more recently. I'm just curious. So I assume that means the baits work, but we know they're spreading the baits.
The baits were,
And I'm just curious if it's just a scale issue, like you can't spread
yeah,
baits
I'm
upstate.
sure that's exactly what it is. Physiologically, it's the same. It should work on
I don't know if there's another.
I'm set, Bob?
They're actually depopulated a lot where they found the virus.
Well, they vaccinated them all. They trapped and vaccinated, plus they put out the baits down Long Island. Which, by the way, I predicted wouldn't work. But it worked. So,
We used to do, and the Canadians probably still do,
They still do.
ponds and Adirondacks and dropping baits by plane.
yeah, fox and raccoon
Yep.
were baiting for up there. And it's been,
We used to do that a
it works
lot.
pretty well. But it's it's time intensive.
USDA is still doing
They still do it. I think
Yeah,
Laura
yeah.
Bigler at Cornell is still working on
She's
that.
doing the New York City part of it.
Oh, okay.
USDA Wildlife Services is up in Lawrence County.
Yep.
And won't go to the-
County.
Wow, I guess the rabies one was pretty popular. We picked a good one to talk about.